sisters coming now.
BioShock 2. In my opinion, this just might be one of the better examples of a video game that represents the definition of what it means to make a great sequel. Whether that is a sequel to a game that didn't fare well or a sequel to a game that is as renowned as the original BioShock, my point still stands here. The second game in this trilogy only enhances my view on that, and having just played it for the very first time, I can say here that this game is awesome in every way. Like I just said, it does everything I like sequels to do for most things in entertainment. In some cases, you could almost kind of look at this game as a bona fide full game DLC to the original game, as there is so much here that is innately like the first, but there's also a lot of different stuff that gets added in that's not from the first. In my opinion, I think the best video games to compare this all to would probably be the Titanfall games. The original Titanfall to this day is, in my opinion, maybe the most underappreciated first-person shooter game ever made, and I loved it. One of the most fun video game experiences I've ever had. Many years later, we got a sequel in Titanfall 2, and it basically does exactly what BioShock 2 does. It carries forward a lot of things that the first game did so well, and only adds a couple of more things into it to add to the experience and the fun. BioShock 2 is the Titanfall 2 to the original BioShock's Titanfall 1. It is such a stark comparison that you honestly can see everything that is so right and good about each. To add on to that, like I said, with the first game when I reviewed it weeks ago in that video that you can find in the cards above, it is also atmospherically such a masterclass into how you make a video game with such great detail to make it feel like a world that is lived in with character, personality, and its concept and setting. From a critical perspective, I would say personally though, there's something about BioShock 2 that I feel is a little lesser than the first game, mainly from the story perspective. We'll talk about that a lot more when we get to that section. I find that the gameplay and the action here, however, was a cool step up from the first. Like I said, it adds new and interesting things while also bringing over some other things that came from the first. It doesn't matter if it comes from the gunplay or the plasmid gameplay that is so uniquely tied into this world. There are new enemies, new lore, and world building that is explored, and even though again the story is not in my opinion as good as the first game, I do like that this game tried hard to add more into this ever-expanding world of the city of Rapture and its characters. So that is the thesis to this video essay for BioShock 2, and if you are ready to dive in with me, no pun intended, be sure to give this video a like if you are somebody who has played the game and loved it like I did, and let's see if we can hit a goal of 50 likes on this video. Jumping into the first section, like I did with my BioShock 1 video essay, I'm going to talk about the atmosphere, concept, and the setting of this world first. Now, in fairness, there is not much really here to expand upon, considering I've probably am going to be saying a lot of the same things that I said with regards to the first game. The first game, in my mind, is atmospherically one of the best video games I think ever made. There is a specific style to it that feels so natural and authentic to the time period, but also the dystopian feeling that comes along with it, no matter if that comes from the characters, the architectural designs of the city of Rapture, or its use of other things like music, character mannerisms, and old school weaponry for the gameplay. This game really holds true to it, and it doesn't move away from it based on what it did in the first. Again, I want to harp on this a lot, but as I jumped into this game, I really did feel like I was just playing a new part of the first game. You would not be mistaken if you would have thought that the original game came with a DLC, and this was that DLC. I also just love, from a remastered perspective, how much more this game comes through the screen, and I can't be thankful enough to this day that I managed to get the remastered collection for $10 on sale when I did. The colors are more vibrant along with the HD quality that really expands how much you can take in as a player from this world. The underwater sections of the game in particular are a good example to show of this. A new part to the game, not from the first, and the upgraded feel brings it out a lot. this section is going to be a little shorter than some of the other ones from this game, particularly because, again, I've already said it before, but this is where the game, and I think this franchise as a whole, regardless of having not played the third game, is at its best. The atmosphere, concept, and setting are basically a character in their own way, and that, in my opinion, is the best part of this franchise. To change up a little bit now from what I did in the first game when I reviewed it, I'm actually going to talk about the story and the characters now before I get to the gameplay. And again, like I mentioned at the beginning, I think this is maybe the weakest part of the game for me. With the first game, my issue with the story is that I felt like I was kind of being dragged along a little bit too much. I feel that can probably be said here as well, but a little less than the first, considering this game does not take as long to beat than the first one did. It's about a few hours, give or take, shorter than the other one. In terms of the actual story itself, the thing that I do appreciate the most about this one, like I said at the beginning, is that it builds upon the first. It adds more details to the conflict that destroyed this underwater city of Rapture and how there was so much more turmoil, division, and destruction between the people and what they were doing. This game takes place in 1968, 8 years after the original, and so even then there's still so much more to learn about in this stretch of time, and the game helps to explain a lot of it with regards to the audio logs and the in-game cutscenes with these characters. The thing that I do find a little frustrating, but not as much, is that there is no reference to the character of Jack from the first. According to the lore and the endings based off the first game, he either becomes the little sister's adoptive father and dies of old age, or he becomes Rapture's new ruler. The thing about BioShock 2 that makes no sense to me is why neither of those endings have any tie into the story of this game. If there are BioShock enthusiasts in my comments, please let me know why this is the case. It just feels like if you are going to make an ending like that in your game, that it would be in some way tying into what you do in this next game that comes after. If Jack becomes the new ruler, then by all means he should have been talked about here with what he did in the years after, leading up to 1968 when this game takes place. That is, however, unless I missed something in the audio logs that mentions him, considering this Sophia Lamb character is the one who takes over as the ruler of Rapture when Andrew Ryan died. Again, I definitely need some explanation as to why this is the case, and I'm mainly just trying to go off what the games told me. I'm sure that there is a lot more lore to it. Characters like Andrew Ryan and Frank Fontaine come back, but for some reason not Jack, and I get that he's mainly a nobody with how the first game brings him in, but even still, it's just weird to look at it that way. To get back to the actual story itself, basically it begins with you as a new character who apparently is an older version of a Big Daddy who had a particular little sister connected to the main villain of this game in Sophia Lamb. Things got out of hand and he was forced to kill himself, only to then be revived by that little sister he was protecting years and years later to where we are now in 1968. So the story basically follows you trying to figure out what happened, akin to how Jack was in the same situation. While uncovering the story of what took place, you learn details of the characters, this little sister who helped you who has that connection to the main villain, and also you learn a lot more about what Rapture was doing with regards to all these science experiments with the Plasmids and how it really affected the people who lived down there. Again, I really like this because you are expanding upon something that feels lived in and connected to that first game and what it was already establishing. I think when you also establish that there was another really bad person in Sophia Lamb akin to Andrew Ryan, who basically both were fighting over what the city of Rapture should be like and how it was controlled, I think you add a much more interesting political element to it as well. I also like how, with those characters, this world is basically establishing the fact that there is really not a lot of good people, and that the people who are good are put in such terrible situations to be able to try and hold up the people who are bad while helping you stop them. For example, in this game, you have a character like Augustus Sinclair, who in some cases is like the Atlas version in this game. However, the difference is he's actually a good guy, and he's not trying to just deceive you by making you do everything that he wants. At the end of the game, he gets captured and turned into a Big Daddy, and uncontrollably is forced to stop you from completing your mission, and you have to kill him, and so in the end, the game really is the one that puts you in a situation where you are forced to do things like this. There are a few other characters where this kind of thing comes about, at least in-game, by your hand as choice. Those characters are Stanley Poole and Grace Holloway. In the game, you learn more about them and that they did very bad things and were in some cases infatuated with Sophia Lamb, and at the very end of their character arcs, you are given a choice to either let them go or kill them. Knowing my sadistic ass, I just went and killed them. I didn't even really give it a single second of thought. You had a bunch of other characters as well sprinkled in throughout route, kind of like how the first game had its own version of mini-bosses. Speaking of bosses, I'm actually kind of glad that this game, from a story perspective, did not go down the route of having a final boss fight. Yes, there is a final battle per se, but it's more against the smaller enemies than just one main final boss, where you have to protect the character of Eleanor Lamb as she tries to figure out how to get into the sub that's going to be launched to the surface with Sophia inside of it, leaving Rapture behind. As somebody who played the game on the lowest difficulty, that wasn't really the most enthralling thing ever, considering I had everything at my disposal, but I am actually still kind of glad it didn't go the route of a final boss. Speaking of which, that now brings us to the two main plots of what the story is about, and I have to say, this is probably my favorite part of the story. This one revolving around you as this Delta Big Daddy and also the character of Eleanor. The Big Daddies in the first game were more so mainly focused on as being an enemy for you to fight rather than it being a huge part of the story, and I'm really glad that this game as a sequel dived more into the lore of how those characters were built and brought out into the city. Even just the fact that you are playing as one, it's just a really cool way to drive the player's thought process into really being interested into why that would be the case, especially when you talk about the fact that the first game just revolves around you playing as a random guy who came across the underwater city. It's a very different contrast between the narratives of both games. One follows a completely random dude that is not pertained to the city at all, and the other one follows somebody who was. So you are classified as Subject Delta in this case, the first Big Daddy to have been successfully paired with a little sister back in 1958. It just so happens that you have been paired with a little sister that is the daughter of the main villain. Right there, you have a pretty solid beginning to an understanding of what the game is about, especially when you factor in that opening cutscene in the game where, like I mentioned earlier, things go wild and you are forced to kill yourself in front of Eleanor. So in a way, this is almost like a story about a father trying to recapture his daughter and escape with her away from the bad of this world around them, including their mother. Eleanor is certainly an interesting character because she is one that starts to become more integral with things like audio logs and whatnot, telling you everything that's going to be going on so much later into the story. That is by the time when you get to the last act of the game and the story starts to unravel even more and you find out the truth of more of the details. With that also comes Sophia killing her own daughter in a cold-blooded and savage way, the good old pillow suffocation technique. In a way, this also kind of cements that in some ways the character of Sophia Lamb might even be more brutal and hated as a villain than, say, a character like Andrew Ryan was. Ryan was certainly a bad guy, but Sophia Lamb in some cases almost maybe takes her way of thinking and her way of doing things too far as well. I mean, at some point you have to say that the line is drawn at killing your own family, and in this case, your own daughter. Now, of course, that did not stop Eleanor from getting her revenge, as after this happens, there is a bit of a stoppage in the game where you are also captured and locked up, but you manage to find a way to transfer yourself into the consciousness of a little sister who goes around and collects parts for a suit for Eleanor to put herself into and come back alive. This essentially is where we get to the topic of the Big Sisters, who are a brand new character to the lore of BioShock, only because of the fact that they were established through this game. The idea is that these Big Sisters that you fight at points in the game are just older versions of little sisters who grew up and had to become these Big Sister versions of Big Daddies in their own suits. With that also comes significantly bigger advantages that a Big Daddy doesn't have. They are faster, more slimmer, making them harder to hit and attack. They can jump and climb walls wherever they want, and I'd say from a perspective, they are also harder to kill with more damage. I like the new addition to this type of character and enemy personally. I wonder if everybody else is the same as me. It lines up correctly with how the timeline is fixed in terms of speaking to the fact that these are just older little sisters that you are killing. This is where I round out my thoughts on the story and some of the main characters, and overall, again, I think this is probably the least good aspect about the game in my opinion, but I still did enjoy it, and I did love learning more about the story, the characters, and the world of this game that they inhabit based off what had occurred in the first. We will talk about the ending, but I want to get to that at the end of this video, as I have some thoughts on that I'm sure you will all want to hear. Speaking to the other characters, I now want to move over to the gameplay of the game. The little sisters in particular play just about the same role as they do in the first game, but with some new mechanics. Like the first one, you can either harvest or rescue them. However, this time, in terms of rescuing them, there is a new addition to the game where you actually adopt them like how a regular Big Daddy would, and you go around and you have them collect Adam from dead bodies. In the first game, you would just witness them them doing this, but here in the second game, you actively participate in it, so I think that's a cool way to really touch into that gameplay, which was what was first shown in the first game. There are also new splicers and enemy character types to fight against. In particular with the big daddies at the beginning of the game, at least you fight off against some of the original versions, but then as you get into the end of the game, you start to come up against these Alpha Series versions of big daddies, which are much more faster and do more damage. They, however, are much more easier to kill, as I've come to find, at least from the perspective of the fact that I was constantly upgrading my weapons, so that's probably a reason as to why they were so easy to kill. I've already talked about the big sisters, so you get the gist of what those kinds of enemies gave with regards to the enemy type. The security devices also make a return, however, in this game, and I found it pretty satisfying that they return in a way that was much lesser than the first one. Basically, they show up in much lesser amounts with regards to attacking you, and I really liked that because you guys know, if you watched my original BioShock video commentary, I talk about the fact that the flying versions are some of the most annoying enemy types that I've ever fought in a video game, at least from a single player perspective. And thankfully, here in this game, they are not that much of a problem. Most of the time, they would have come from your inability to successfully hack something, but hacking in this game became easier too, so it wasn't much of an issue for me. The splicers make a return, most of which are the same from your Houdinis, leadheads, spiders, thuggish ones, but this time around there are no nitro bomb throwing ones. They have instead replaced them with more powerful and big brute splicers that pack a punch and have more health. A nice change to the difficulty the splicers bring, and together with the alpha big daddies, they prove as being the two toughest enemies in the game. In terms of weapons, this is definitely a leg up from the first game that I really enjoyed. This time you don't have the chemical thrower, wrench, pistol, or the crossbow, but instead you get the drill, a hacking tool gun, rivet gun, and spear gun. More modified looking versions of the machine gun, grenade launcher, and shotgun also make a return. Considering that you are a big daddy in the game, the drill being a thing to use is so awesome. It's such a fun weapon to use, especially when modified like how I had it. The hacking tool gun is a new take on the hacking where you now can shoot things to hack it. It's not always needed, but for long range hacks against cameras or security devices, it's definitely going to have its uses. The machine gun is now just a minigun essentially, which makes sense since you are a big daddy. More ammo and packs a bigger punch. I liked it other than when it could come with a big kick in the recoil, which thankfully you would fix with an upgrade. The same goes with the launcher. It's the same version as last time with a different look, but it holds some bigger kick in its power, and it might be the one weapon you'd think to use the most because of that reason. The shotgun has returned as well, but this time as a double-barreled version. Probably one of my favorite guns to use personally, especially with the slug rounds, which could send splicers flying back in hilarious ways. The rivet gun is honestly personally my second least favorite, which is unfortunate because both new weapons are my least favorite. This gun, which is essentially just a nail gun of sorts, just didn't work for me in terms of its power or really its personality. When holding it or firing it, I just don't feel the weight that other weapons have. The same goes for that new other weapon in the spear gun. I just couldn't care less with this weapon, at least from the perspective of the regular shot type. The rocket shot type felt like something out of Gary's Mod, if anybody knows that reference, and so that was just a very fun shot type to use for that weapon, but otherwise I just really couldn't care. Overall, the weapons as a whole brought some fun moments that I enjoyed. The research camera, while not a weapon, also actually felt like a much lesser inclined tool to use. The research element of the gameplay was one that I just didn't latch onto that much, especially when talking about the fact that this game leans more to you using the camera before you fight an enemy as a way to capture the research, whereas in the first game you would just take a picture of the dead body. Of course, the part of the gameplay that's always the best to use and experience are the plasmids. Just like the first game, I found this to be such an awesome form of gameplay, and of course it fits in with the world that it's created around. The idea of gene splicing up your body to give you these powers is just one of the more cooler things you can do in a science fiction property. Of course, for the most part, many of the same ones from the first game return here. However, I will give one criticism towards the game as a whole with regards to this gameplay function. Because of the fact that there is no new game plus in this game for whatever reason, I find it unfortunate that some of the plasma powers become useless and not as well used to their potential by the time that you get to the end of the game. Of course, this also comes with depending on what you want to spend all your atom currency on. You can find these plasmids naturally, but you can also pay for them as well, and I find that sometimes it just feels necessary to only use 1 or 2 at a time. For me, I always found myself using primarily either Electrobolt, Incinerate, or Telekinesis. It was only once we got to the end of the game where I purchased the Freeze plasmid and started using that more often, but the problem was that I was only able to use it for such a short amount of time because of how long it took me to get to the point where I could get it. This leads into the fact that without a New Game Plus, the game doesn't really fully allow you to realize the potential and the upgrading of these plasmids. I never once used the Cyclone Trap, I never once used Decoy, I never once used Security Command, Scout, and barely used Insect Swarm. By the time we got to the end of the game, the 2 that I used the most were probably Summoning Eleanor, Winter Blast, and of course the other 3 main ones that I just mentioned. I feel like those 3 are just maybe the most fun to use, but also the ones that make the most sense to use. Again, I like the fact that each of these plasmids have their own identity and personality to it, but I just don't think that the game's systems allow you to really fully realize the potential that they have to be used. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that this game would benefit way more if it did have a New Game Plus. This also kind of leads into the other areas of the game that I felt were a little lacking from the gameplay. For one, and maybe this is just me because of the fact that I played it on the lowest difficulty, but I found that as I got to the end of the game, there was really no reason to loot anymore. I had been maxing out almost everything that I had so many times that looting in any area pretty much felt so tedious to me that I just gave up. Again, maybe this is because of the fact that I was on such a low difficulty, but at some points when you are fighting enemies that don't take much to kill and don't take much of your resources to do so, there is a bit of lagging to want to collect anything at all. For that matter, there's even a bit of lag to want to even buy anything from the vending machines. I like that they brought those back because they fit into the atmosphere of the world of what you are playing in, but they just felt so useless this time around as opposed to when I played the first game. It's like at some point you do have to make collecting loot reasonable to where it's not so overbearing that you feel like you have to constantly feel like you have to pick something up. As a player being maxed out on everything, that's totally fine to feel, but then that just renders the uselessness that the game's systems bring of its purpose. At no point past the first act or so did I ever feel like I was in danger of losing a lot of loot, and I feel like that is something that should always be cared for reasonably when playing a game like this. It gives the player the thought process of making clear and conscious choices of what to use and what not to use for when and why. That's pretty much the extent to how I feel about the gameplay, and now I want to branch off into a final section for this video essay commentary where we actually talk about the ending of the game, which I alluded to earlier. I didn't include it in the story part because this section actually ties into where my journey will be going for the third game. As far as I can gather, the third game has no ties to these 2 games, at least that I can gather as somebody going into playing the third game for the first time. The way that the game ends with its multiple endings definitely leaves me intrigued to see if I am wrong about that. Of the 2 main endings that it gives you, where you either have to sacrifice yourself or save yourself, I chose to save myself, which means that Eleanor takes all the atom out of your body and your conscious is put into hers. Basically, you become her in a way, and then you also see the bodies of the city come up from underneath to the surface. The other ending, you sacrifice yourself, but in a way to where she doesn't collect the atom out of your body. The details of that ending are a little weird to me, and I'm kind of glad I chose the ending that I did. In the case of Rapture, I think it is implied that the city is eventually just going to collapse in on itself and just die away, because it never once occurred to me that the actual city was going to be destroyed with the events at the end. Maybe this is also explained in the third game, but we'll have to wait and see, and so overall, I'm just curious to know how everybody here thought about the ending of this game. Apparently, there is also another ending which revolves around Eleanor seeing the little sisters come up from underneath alive, but that's an ending that is not actually in the game, at least that I can gather. Either way, it's just a very interesting way to end off these 2 particular games considering where the third one goes. With regards to the third game in BioShock Infinite, I am very much looking forward to this one because as a kid, I always remember seeing the commercials for this game and seeing how fun and insane it actually looked. It seems like it's also going to follow a lot of new characters, a new world, new enemies and powers, and so I'll be very curious to know how it lines up with the first 2 games, or if it's just its own separate story. With that all being said, I think we have come to the end of my video essay commentary for BioShock 2. I've really had an awesome time playing these first 2 games, and again, I feel like atmospherically, these first 2 are just such a masterclass in how they were made. As somebody who loves the idea of exploring worlds through their development and the lore that that it's surrounding in, that is by far my favorite thing with regards to playing. BioShock 2 only amplified that even more, and even though I didn't like it as much as BioShock 1, it is still such a great sequel to a masterpiece of a video game. I cannot wait to see you all for BioShock Infinite when I am done playing this game and finishing up its trilogy. The final thing that I want you all to do right now, and the most important thing in this video, is to comment down below your thoughts. Tell me how you feel about the game, whether it was when you played it back in the day, or if you played it for the first time nowadays with regards to the remastered version. Do you prefer BioShock 2 over the first game, or is it vice versa? And finally, what are your thoughts on my commentary on the game? Do you agree or disagree with some of the things that I said? Do all this by commenting below, and also, as I said at the beginning, like this video if you enjoyed, but also if you really like BioShock 2. Subscribe if you are new here to this channel and looking forward to more video essay commentaries in the future, and turn on that notification bell to be updated when I do bring more. I hope everyone here has a wonderful rest of the day, and I will see you all soon for BioShock Infinite. This is Orion, signing out.